Welcome to Holyrude Ungagged, the Alexander Hamilton of political podcasts. Another fun-packed week in UK and Scottish politics. The first thing we'll be talking about today is quite a sad story. We'll look at is the DWP and if their systemic failures are actually resulting in deaths. We'll also then look at a poll that was certainly a surprise to me that said that Scotland would vote to keep the monarchy after independence. Ahead of the COP26 summit, a report was released that said that Glasgow and the Greater Glasgow area, to be more accurate, would need billions of pounds of infrastructure spending in order to insulate themselves from the effects of climate change. We'll then talk about the surprise win for Labour in the Batley and Spen by-election. All the predictions were saying that Labour were going to lose that seat, even though they've held it since I think the 80s. But in the end, it was they managed to hold on with a very slim margin. And of course, as ever, we'll be talking about more Tory corruption. If there's anything else that you think we should be talking about on Holyrude Ungagged, tweet us at _ungagged, #Holyrude Ungagged, or send us an email at ungaggedleft@gmail.com, putting Holyrude Ungagged in the subject line. I've got to be joined today by my usual comrades. We've got the Falkirk's Pizza Hut Prince, Brian Finlay, and we've also got Deborah Torrance, who's crawled out her sickbed to be with us today. But that's the kind of trooper she is. So without any further ado, let's get ungagged. Hi everybody, welcome. Another fun-packed edition of Holyrude Ungagged. How's your week been so far? Up to anything interesting?
All good, thank you. Nice to get out and about, been to the shops, even went to a wedding.
I was going to say that, you said you were at a wedding.
I was at a wedding for the first time, yeah, which was wild, but it was good. It was really, really good. It was all done pretty much mostly outdoors, which was interesting. Little tents, which is quite nice. It was good.
And you say the first time, you don't mean the first time ever, I take it?
What, to have been to a wedding?
Aye, I'm sure you've been to a wedding before.
Oh, I was like a serial wedding guest before COVID. But it was nice to be back in a wedding, but nice that it was mostly outdoors as well. So it was good. Enjoyed it.
I once went to a stag night. It was my friend's younger brother, and I was so much fun in the stag night. They phoned me up like a few days later and told me I was promoted to an all-day guest at the wedding. That's how much fun I am in a stag night.
That's quite an achievement, and you should feel proud of that.
I posted a Wolf of Wall Street meme about it. You know, when you're standing in the arms of it.
My friends got married outside in a tent a couple of years ago before the pandemic, before it was trendy. It was lovely.
Yeah, I know some people that get a big kind of marquee sort of thing.
And they're fancy. They're fancy. They're not like the tents you get at the Girl Guides. They're like proper.
They are not.
Proper fancy tents.
But the air still passes through. There's movement of air. You feel safer. Social distancing. Fabulous.
As long as you avoid gale force winds, I suppose they'd be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's what I got up to this weekend, getting caught in torrential rain in shorts and t-shirts. Was nice.
It's a nice Scottish summer there.
Yeah, my girlfriend and I went a nice walk in the necropolis in Glasgow. She'd never actually been across the bridge and up the hill. So I went, come on, I'll show you John Knox. And went right up the top. And then just as we were coming down, we got caught in, I think, a month's worth of rain in about 20 minutes. And we were huddled under a tree. And this German couple looked absolutely horrified at like, what is happening? Is this the end of the world?
Is this it?
And we Glasgow guys just stoating by in a t-shirt and shorts. I'm like, taps off a minute ago.
I've had a few sort of walks around the necropolis just because all four of my kids was born in a hospital just across the road. So At some point, I've always had a loose end or waiting for like the ward to open up or whatever. And it seems like the best place to go for a wander.
It's a lovely walk.
It's a good sauntering ground. And my dad had his kidney operation in Glasgow Royal. So I was just like sauntering about around the necropolis, doing a wee bit of exploring, which is fun.
It's a beautiful wee bit of nature in the middle of the city. It's lovely, lots of diversity. We saw a nice wee tortoiseshell butterfly, lots of bees, and It was nice. It was sad as well, obviously, because you're walking around a graveyard, but it feels much more like a tourist attraction than an actual graveyard anymore.
Visit Glasgow.
Yeah. Visit Glasgow. And people had thrown money into some of the sort of mausoleums that are behind gates. And I was like, that's really weird. How's nobody came up and scraped them out yet? Glasgow entrepreneurs.
Much did you get?
I didn't get in. My arms weren't long enough, and then it started raining.
Well, I'm just trying to survive the school holidays, and the three girls are away to some. I don't know if it's dancing or gymnastics or whatever they had yesterday. They have the other one today. So my wife's taking them to that, and the baby is with his nana at the moment. But the 2-year-old went on a rampage yesterday with an ink marker, which was not fun. So still trying to clean that off the walls. We managed to clean it off her. We managed to clean it off her 3-month brother that she tried to colour in. It's just...
She's just expressing her creativity. Don't stifle that.
She's just expressing her insanity. There's no stopping her.
I don't miss the school holidays. During my time working in hospitality, working in family restaurants, I'm glad to say that I'd never fully aware exactly when the school holidays are anymore, which is... I feel really content about that.
Like some Tory MSPs. Did you see that this week?
Yeah, that was brilliant. What is it? Maurice Golden, wasn't it?
Yep.
Maurice Golden. Why? Where is the outrage?
He tried to slam the Scottish government for the fact that testing rates in school were lower than they've been at any other month, and everybody took great joy in pointing out to him the schools have been shut for the last couple of weeks. So, I mean, how do you not know that? You know, you're an MSP, for God's sake. You think you know when the school's shut for the summer?
Tourism rots your brain.
Yeah, it's because the private schools go with the English holidays in it.
You know what? That might be true.
There you go.
I think you've corrected it.
There you go. Ooh. Genius.
Right, I think we should get started. After all that hilarity, I've got to bring us down because this is quite a kind of sad story about a case reported by the Disability News Service. A young man called Kerr Featherstone who took his own life after DWP cut his personal independence payments. He suffers from extreme anxiety and he was very vulnerable. And his mum describes how the whole process with the DWP just made him feel worthless. It's sad, but it's not an isolated story. We've heard sort of stories not exactly like this, but not dissimilar either. It just seems as if cruelty is just built into the whole process with the DWP. Deborah, you've got some experience with this.
Yeah, I've applied for PIP. I got DLA. I done the transition, and let me tell you, it's stressful. The questions they ask you in the form. Well, first of all, the form's like a bloody novel, and it's very focused on, precise measurements. Doesn't give you any leeway for fluctuating conditions. And I mean, one of the examples they give you is, can you walk 2 lengths of a double-decker bus? And it's like, well, I don't know, I can't get to the bus stop. So it's a horrible process to go through, and I feel nothing but just sorrow and pain for the guy's family. I mean, so many families. I was really lucky in the fact that when I went for my PIP interview at I can't remember, is it Argyle Street now? It used to be in Cadogan House, which was an old tenement with stairs, and the lift was always out of order. But I found out later that was to see how disabled you really were, if you could get up the stairs. And then the place that's at Argyle Street now, it's like a clinic, man. It's really clinical feeling going into it. So you're sort of stressed out, like, am I going to get examined here? And then they're so cold. That was the other thing that, there was no like level of customer service. It was just pretty brutal. And they take you into a room, but see if you can't go to this place, they'll come to your house, which I think would be even more intimidating. Mm-hmm. Like just having a stranger come in your house and be like, how many times do you wet yourself? How have you emptied your bowels accidentally? And it's like, I don't really know you. One question that my sister-in-law was asked by these guys, just to give you an example of how brutal they are. My sister-in-law was diagnosed with Huntington's disease, which is a really progressive and degenerative neurological condition, and she used to be a shop manager for a clothes outlet, and then she was a postmistress at the post office, like in the sorting office. So she was, she had some savvy about her, and she couldn't understand money anymore. That was one of her first symptoms. And the woman was asking her, so if you bought something at £3 and gave me £5, how much change would you get? And she was getting herself really upset because she was trying to explain, I don't know. What do you mean £5? And the woman kept berating her consistently. And she got so upset, she just shut down and stopped speaking. And they were saying, you're being difficult. It says here that you've had bladder accidents. How many litres of urine do you wet yourself in a day? This is after traumatizing someone. So you can maybe hear me getting a bit upset talking about it. And it's because of the way the current benefit system makes a disabled person feel. They make them feel unworthy. They make them feel useless, incapable. It's a horrible, horrible, horrible thing. But as I said, I was lucky because the woman who actually interviewed me knew my MS nurse, and she was really familiar with, the terms I was using. And I went in with a big list, but also I was physically disabled because I was in my wheelchair. Imagine you have an invisible disability and you have to go through this. And the mental stress it has on a person who's had to fight for diagnoses that they might still not have. People can go years, decades without a diagnosis. They can have no actual name for what's wrong with them. These are, the things that I need help with. But that's not the questions they really ask you. It's all about what can't you do? Why can't you do it? I don't want to greet, but I really do feel like greeting because so many people have died. So many people have taken their own lives. And this report that's been released by the DWP, have you got the details on that, David, on when it was released? No. I couldn't find the actual data either. Could you, Brian?
No.
I did find a thing that it did mention how the DWP deliberately don't collate a lot of this information.
Yeah.
So they release a lot of raw data that
is
difficult for people to interpret. And I don't think that's certainly not an accident.
No.
Because they're trying to obscure some of these issues. Listening to you talk about that, Deborah, it reminded me a lot because my mum, I've been a carer for her sort of on and off since I was a teenager, and she's went through a lot of the sort of similar things. And it's like an interrogation. It's like they're testing your story to try and catch you in an inconsistency or catch you in a lie, and it encourages people to then not be honest with the DWP either, because, like you said, if somebody's got a variable condition, if they say, "Can you walk like a mile or walk 2 lengths of a bus?" as you say, somebody with some conditions can say, "Oh, in a good day I could, but that's once in a blue moon. Most of the time I could never do that." They'll write down, "Yeah, you can do it."
Mm-hmm.
So, it's welfare rights people will say to people, if they ask you any question, interpret that as your worst day, because they will try to use it against you if you be too honest with them. Brian, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I've only had one personal experience of going through universal credit. That's when I broke my ankle and had 2 surgeries on my ankle. And the reason that I ended up on universal credit initially was because I was on a 0-hour contract with my employer. So statutory sick pay isn't covered because I didn't earn enough. So to get any support, you had to go through universal credit. But just, hearing Deborah's experiences and referring to the story that we're talking about today and some of this raw data, and this is something that I read quite at length about people's experiences on universal credit, and it's so consistent and everybody's saying the same thing. So why is this not changing? And we know why it's not changing, because the governments that we have in place, the rollout of it was shambolic. It's clearly been designed in a way to catch people out. It's clearly been designed by people who don't understand the different conditions and the complexity of conditions. We're not, you can't put people that are dealing with really debilitating illnesses in the same bracket as somebody who has had an accident and has to claim for statutory sick pay, because the processes are totally different. But even with that one experience that I do have, even I found it extremely stressful, because it happened at a time when my partner, who does care for his mum too, that he had lost his dad and he was spending a lot of time caring for his mum. And it was basically like, because the online sort of identification systems wasn't working, even though I had all the ID that was expected of me, still wasn't linking up. So that's me, who's privileged enough to have a passport, a driving license, all these types of things.
Yeah.
I still couldn't do the online verification. And they're like, so you're going to have to come down. I was like, I live in a second floor flat, and I've just had, I can't leave the house, and my partner, who's quite far away at the moment, caring. And they're like, well, we can't process any further just now, or we can organise somebody to come out, which might take, weeks, months, whatever. And it just shows you that system is not fit for purpose, because if you are going to have like a heartless system that's going to withhold finance from people for 6 weeks, which that in itself is wrong, you need to ensure that it needs to be as accessible as possible. I mean, my views on the welfare state is pretty well known. I've always been quite vocal about it. But the only way forward for it is to have a universal basic income, so it removes the stigma and it has access for everybody. And if we're going to have top-ups, which we absolutely should for anyone who is disabled, anyone who is suffering from real hardship because of illness, then it needs to be as inclusive, and it needs to be designed by people who's experienced this heartless system, and people who would know, well, what do we actually need? I mean, you're talking about what can't you do? Well, why don't we encourage people to say, well, what can you do? Do you want to do X, Y, and Z? Can you do this for work? Can you, X, Y, and Z? And I think, if we're talking about how this chap felt, suffering from anxiety is something that I can very much relate to. But to be layered on top of that, I can't even understand, him be disabled, being, having all this finance removed from him, because I'm privileged enough to have the support function around me for financially. I can't compute how that would feel, and I understand how somebody would actually feel so worthless by the state. Yeah. The state. This isn't somebody feeling worthless because of a personal relationship or because of a private relationship with somebody. This is the state that's doing this, that's providing state services. These are mostly private companies that are providing these state services. Yeah. But this is designed by the state. And I find that really difficult. I know how heartless this Conservative government can be. I've read it, I'm aware of it. But when you actually sit and really think about it, it is so difficult to compute that somebody's designed something that way to make somebody feel so worthless and excluded.
And degraded.
And I can't get my head around it.
It's when at the heart of it, it's that conservative mindset that they don't trust anybody and they think the worst in everybody. That's why they design it on the basis that everybody's trying to scam, mainly because they're all scamming for very much more money than you can get for PIP or DLA. But also it's like all these questions that they force people to undergo, these humiliating sort of degrading sort of processes. They could find out all this information with a 2-minute conversation with somebody's GP, but they don't trust the GPs either. Mm-hmm. They assume everybody's GP is, I don't know, they assume GPs are going to conspire to defraud money out of the state for a patient,
Well, we can't really rationalise it, can we?
It's paranoia as policy.
We can't. You're right. We can't rationalise it because we don't get it. And this is what happens when you design a system to try and. Obviously, we know that it is degrading. We know that it is, exclusionary, and it makes people feel worthless. But this is a system that's designed to not allow people to get away with things. And I wish they would apply that same principle to tax evasion, to business operations, and even employers' responsibility to their employees. Let's apply that same logic and the same principle to that. But we know that they don't want to do that because that doesn't benefit their ideology. It doesn't benefit their donors. So it shows that if the UK wants to provide something that is robust, and they've graded us to be robust for the wrong reason, it can be done. And it's just horrifying. And like you said, we can't rationalize it because I don't understand why you would want to put somebody who is clearly vulnerable, who clearly needs help. People need help, and they're having to rely on services like, the Citizens Advice Bureau, who are overwhelmed, kept afloat by people volunteering. And generally, as we know, if you look at society and how often people work and the sporadic nature of how people work, people don't have the time to volunteer unless they are themselves privileged financially, or that they are in a position that they have the time, the flexibility to be able to do that. So it is just Tory ideology gone mad. And there's so many layers to this, where you look at the employment situation, you look at the welfare state, and this sort of free market neoliberalism provided by private companies. And it's just so difficult to understand.
Also, the system sort of puts disabled people in a box in terms of, if somebody's at a condition that is variable and maybe they couldn't hold down a full-time job because of that, because they'd be off too often, but maybe they could do voluntary work. But the DWQ, if they were managing to go out and do a kind of shift in a charity shop or something, the DWQ would use that against them to then take away their benefits. I think, was it Frankie Boyle? I remember making a joke around about the time of the Olympics, Paralympics, where he said it must be difficult for all these British Paralympians knowing that if they get a gold medal, the DWP will use it as a reason to take away their benefits. And he's quite right, because the whole system is designed in order to get what somebody's entitled to. They need to play into this narrative of a completely disempowered, disabled person that can't do anything, and that's the only way they'll deem you worthy of basic sort of dignity and support.
They also use bureaucracy as a deterrent. Like they want you to jump through every hoop, and if you mess up one application, that could have ramifications on other benefits that you might receive, whether that's council tax benefit or housing benefit. You could get some level of universal credit top up or employment and support allowance. And then the employment and support allowance, there's two different types. You get contributions based and you get non-contributions based. And these are legacy benefits that lots of people are still on. And they want us all on this universal credit because it's easy for them just to go, we seen that you done an hour extra shift and you're getting an extra £10 in your wages. So we're just going to stop everything till you sort this out because you didn't report it in our system. Even when people have reported it in their system. And as Brian says, the system doesn't work because it's like, is it incompetence or is this a deliberate tactic to keep bringing down the social welfare bill? Because that's what the Tories want. They want to bring that down, rise the nuclear bill, get that. We can afford how many billions in nuclear warheads, but we can't afford to give a single mother a wee extra £20 a week. Except Scottish Government is doing that, isn't it? The Scottish Government is continuously mitigating the UK welfare state. And going back to this story about this guy and just referring to the doctors that you were talking about, David, they had all the information. They could, that poor gentleman didn't have to go through what he went through. And is reading the story, if you haven't read it, please go and read it on the Disability News Network. We'll put a wee tweet under the pod. It's so sad and really, really heartbreaking. And I just echo everything you guys have said. And sorry for getting upset earlier on.
No, that's fine. Sorry.
It's a horrible, horrible, degrading system that is just unfit for purpose. And coming out of the COVID crisis, there's going to be a lot of folk who are going to have to rely on this. So it needs a kick up the arse.
Just to pick up your mention of bureaucracy, they definitely do use that because Mum for a long time was in DLA, and obviously I think it was every 3 years they made her get reassessed, and that was always such a stressful time for our family because we didn't know if they were just going to. A lot of time what they do, they just stop it, and then you'd have to go through appeals process and they give it back because they knew a certain amount of people would just no appeal. just because they couldn't face it. And then finally, when she got told that she was awarded DLA and it wouldn't need to be reassessed, it was like for life. She was so relieved, and then a couple of years later they announced, oh, we're bringing in this new system, PIP, so everybody that's in DLA will now need to get reassessed for that. Another bizarre bureaucratic thing is when my stepfather died, they told her to apply for a bereavement benefit. So she applied like they said, and I can't remember the amount, but whatever that X amount she got for bereavement benefit, the next day she got a letter in saying, now that you're in bereavement benefit, we're deducting that amount from your ESA. And it's like, well, what was the point in that?
Yeah.
You know, all this letters getting sent, processed in order to just deduct the exact same amount that from a different benefit. It was ludicrous.
And the bureaucratic nature of universal credit, in principle, could have made things a lot easier for people if it was applied properly and done fairly. Because if you have all of these different, and all of these different benefits going into one system, so that it could be applied so that everybody's getting the maximum amount that they should be entitled to and they should be receiving, but ideologically it wasn't used as that. And just to echo again from the bureaucratic, and it's crazy that this is only 3 of us that have got all these different experiences, or people that we know that have been through these experiences, is that I've got a family member down south who has been off their work for a year with a really, really bad arthritis in his back and in his hands, and he went through PIP and was knocked back twice, and then was finally awarded it a 3rd time. And his money was then backdated for, I think it was like 6 or 7 months, 8 months. How can you expect somebody, to even accept that somebody needs that help, but to assume that they should have been able to fund themselves for 6 to 7 months? Well, the UK government, who has access to all the money that they need, is able to sort of, police this situation in a certain way with private companies and belittling somebody and leaving them with essentially nothing, and then saying, oh, but we're going to backdate it and that's fine. It's just crazy. And these stories are so common, and that's particularly why I get really angry when people seem to have this adoptive view that, the spongers, the stigma that's attached to people who are claiming state support. Well, the reason it's been designed is to make people's quality of life better. And I think that we need to really get back to that attitude really, really quickly.
I remember I was working in homelessness when the universal credit was sort of just before it sort of came in. And one of the things that kept coming up was, well, in theory, when you talk about it, how, it's simplifying it instead of having all these different benefits to keep track of. It's just sort of, you're folding it all into the one. But I spoke to people who were like when they cancel my DLA, I can manage to survive on my ESA until my appeal comes through and I get my DLA money back. But if I've only got one benefit, what am I going to do when they inevitably cancel it at some point and I have to wait for an appeal? And that was what terrified a lot of people. Also, the fact that I was working in homelessness with people with addictions. The fact that they were changing it from fortnightly to monthly was a huge concern, because I was working with people that couldn't budget. It was like we were seriously worried that people would die because they were suddenly getting a whole month's worth of benefits at the one time, that a lot of which they would drink, and then they'd have 3 weeks with no money at all. So just the whole system's just a mess, and it's by design.
And it is by design, and it's entirely culpable that this UK government is responsible for it. And I do also just to kind of echo what Deborah was saying about, I know that the Scottish government has mitigated quite a few of these types of things, but I believe that there's also an opportunity for the Scottish government to go further in terms of raising taxes at the higher end, and to mitigate some of these other policies that have come into play over the last few years, child cap benefit, for example. And I'm aware that we need further powers to really try and roll out universal basic income trials and things like that. But this, in light of how more dependent people are going to be on the welfare state, needs to really be top of the agenda. And I would really hope to see in these discussions between the Scottish Greens and the SNP, if there is going to be any formal agreement, that these equalities types of issues will get the foot up the arse that they need.
Yeah. Just to follow up that, coming out of COVID situation, there's going to be a lot of people who will find themselves in exactly the same situation I was in, where we don't know about long COVID, we don't know how disability is going to work, but also people are just going to end up being unemployed because their businesses that they were employed with have closed. So they're going to, they might have mortgages that they need to pay. And an interesting thing is the DWP won't pay your mortgage, but they'll pay the interest on your mortgage to make sure the bank gets paid. It's it's so frustrating. I can't, we need to move on to the next issue before I start reading again. Making me worried about my next review that's coming up.
Well, let's do that then and move on. So there was a poll came out from Panelbase and it said that Scotland, post-independence, would vote to keep the monarchy. It said that 47% preferred a royal head of state in favour of 35% who said they would rather have an elected head of state, and there was 18% of people who were unsure. I don't know about you, but that surprised me. My first thought was, where did they do this poll? Larkhall Main Street? But then maybe I'm biased with my circle of friends is not sort of royal friendly, shall we say?
Royal friendly. I think with this particular poll, was it not the Times readers in Scotland? I'm not 100% sure, but I've read this somewhere that it might be.
I don't know.
Times.
I just assumed with it being panel-based that it was...
I think it was commissioned by the Times, and it was like 1,297 Times readers or something.
I'm clutching at straws because it would be really great if it was the Times readers, because I'd be like, that sounds about right. Yeah,
I'm glad you cheered us up with this topic because it is really
funny. Yeah, it's really funny. Yeah, really, really interesting outcome then if that's but anyway, what? I just don't understand why. You know what? It would be interesting. I think that once Scottish independence or even when an independence referendum is coming up, that these sort of discussions will be a lot more prominent perhaps than they were last time. That I think that perhaps taking snapshot polls during these times, I think would be more representative, because I don't really think that a lot of people are necessarily thinking about the Scottish independence and the fact of removing the monarchy, as we kind of sail through COVID. Maybe if you'd done this poll after the Oprah Winfrey interview, it might have been a slightly different outcome. I don't know. I'd be shocked if that is genuinely how people feel. My view on the monarchy is I'd like to be a republic, and we can give royal family social housing, that's fine. But I'm just sort of like, I think most people are genuinely just ambivalent towards them. And I think that it would be really interesting to drill down a little bit more into where people actually sit within it, and perhaps ask more prudent questions about the funding and what powers they have and the land. Actually talk about the land and talk about how that land is used a bit more, because people might think, oh, it's really lovely, we get a wee mug, and there's a nice wee wedding every couple of years, and all the tourists they bring, which is never really connected in research, by the way. So I just think it would be good to actually have a real discussion around the monarchy and actually how the exploitation, particularly of land, really plays into a lot of the inequality, particularly in Scotland and the sort of Highlands area and further up north.
Well, it's even relevant in the Central Belt. The Crown Estate owns loads of shopping centres. I think Fort Kinnaird is one that's out at Edinburgh.
Explains a lot.
Makes how many billions a year? I'm really shocked that, I don't think it's reflective of Scottish society at all. I don't think Times readership is very reflective of Scottish society. But I know folk who love the royals, but they love sort of the Tudors, just the history of it all, and the tradition. They're sort of history geeks, but they also had a party for the royal wedding and a bit much. And I need to tell you now, I went to I sat in the corner just eating my hot dog. It was all right.
Deborah's been removed from the chat.
This is just following up from last week, so I was soft on monarchy. I don't think monarchy question necessarily has to come at the independence referendum as a topic. I think it's something that can be addressed afterwards, where we can have another referendum, never end them, and we can get that republic. I would like to see an actual a poll, as you say, when we're going through the next referendum, and see what it's then, because I doubt very much it's that high.
My instinct would be that the 35% that want an elected head of state is quite solid in wanting that, and the 47%, I mean, there is obviously definitely very ardent monarchists in areas of Scotland, but a lot of that 47%, I think, are people that are a bit more casual about it and don't feel particularly strongly, but haven't really been exposed to sort of an alternative.
I think a good time to have it would be when old Lizzie passes.
Well, that's what I was thinking. I was thinking in an independent Scotland, we could decide not only to have a referendum when, let's say, when Charles ascends to the throne, rather than talk about somebody dying.
Yeah.
But also have it to say that we'll do that every time there's a new monarch. We'll have a referendum to confirm them, because that does give us more. That means we only need to win once, but they need to win every time.
No, I think that there will be a shift in attitude once Charles ascends the throne, because obviously Elizabeth II's been there for some time. But where the monarchy goes once Charles ascends the throne, does he actually ascend the throne for a particular time? Does he abdicate? Does William and his bird take over? And that makes and that perhaps modernizes the monarchy in some way. I really don't know, but it's true. I think there's a lot of things in Scottish society that's going to be like a refresh point for this particular discussion. Obviously, once we've gone through the sort of health crisis of the pandemic, and we head towards a discussion around India F2 and our own constitution, I think it would be very much in the spotlight. Plus, once Charles does eventually ascend the throne, and there's changes in the monarchy that way too, there'll be a lot of moving parts to this discussion. So I think that we, like you're saying, 35% saying we want an elected head of state, that I really can't see them being persuaded by, a slight change, and we'll give you some of the palaces back, but I really can't see them, them shifting necessarily in their point of view. But once these discussions actually start happening, this 47% could be like, what? What is actually happening? And because I think that the public is shielded in the sort of mainstream discourse about what actually the royal estate, the crown estate actually is.
Yeah, and I certainly think a lot of people are unaware exactly how much real power and influence they still wield.
Yeah.
They're always portrayed as just figureheads that don't have any real power, but that's not really true at all. A lot of the sort of unionists were really trumpeting this poll when it came out, and my response is just simple. Okay, well, if you're that sure, let's prove it. Let's have a referendum like post-independence. And I doubt they'd be quite as confident in their poll then.
Yeah.
I don't think there'll be much discussion during the actual independence referendum, because I don't think either side particularly want to muddy the issue by bringing the monarchy into it. I don't think either are convinced that it would be helpful to them, or whether they would alienate more people than they might bring in. I don't think anybody can really say for sure what would happen there. But definitely once independence is established, I'll be happy to have a referendum about whether we have a republic or continue with this decrepit old institution.
It's quite exciting, like the fact that these sort of discussions could actually potentially happen. I know that it all seems a bit unsure at the moment when India F2 will be. I think that there definitely will be another independence referendum. We can't say when that's going to be, but the fact that it could actually open up these discussions about things like the European Union discussion will have to happen at some point. I really don't think that necessarily should be too prominently through the India F2 campaign, but these other really, really big constitutional questions could actually be discussed and voted on in Scotland, because I don't really see a referendum on the monarchy happening under this current UK setup in the slightest. So I think that it's quite exciting to actually see that there could be an opportunity for these discussions to be had and these votes to be had in Scotland once independence is established. And that's something to be quite excited and positive about.
Yeah, I mean, in the kind of UK framework, like you saw, a Corbyn government would probably be the most radical British government, certainly in decades. And even they had to sort of publicly, declare that they would not be pursuing any kind of abolition of the monarchy, which I can understand. Like, it wouldn't necessarily be a priority. There's a lot of other things they need to address. So I will not criticising them for that. But even that, even something as difficult to imagine as like a Corbyn government, they even weren't in a position where they felt that they could touch that issue.
When the poll came back, what was it? How many people wanted an elected head of state? Was it 35?
35.
Did they stipulate what sort of position it would be? Would it be just literally symbolic? Would it be could we elect a Doug to be the head of state, or a nice Highland coup? I don't know. I want Scotland to have that sort of freedom come independence. I don't want us to be bound to a sort of archaic monarchist system. I mean, we're going to be a brand new country. Let's step away from
refresh.
Refresh. Control.
You want something more progressive, like a dog as head of
Aye.
state.
Yeah.
Why not? Hey, some of the best towns in America have like cats for mayors. Don't knock it till you've tried it.
That's mental.
I'm telling you, I'm going to have to Google it now and tell you
Yeah,
the
the
animal mayors.
And I think so too, that we're in a bit, because the British establishment and the British state is so stuffy when you've got things like the unelected House of Lords and all these types of things, that in the independent Scotland, what would a second chamber look like in terms of, would it be an elected Senate style? Would it be citizens' assemblies? All of these types of things. So, it's a really exciting opportunity just in itself to look at the Constitution and look at the elected institutions that we have.
I just want to tell you about Duke, who's a 9-year-old Great Pyrenees, a big dog, and he is the mayor of Cormorant in Minnesota. And then Stubbs, a cat, is the mayor of Talkeetna in Alaska, and he has been for 15 years. He's a dedicated public servant. I'm
sure there's plenty of yes groups that will happily invite you along to talk about your idea for animal head of state.
Absolutely. And I just want to congratulate the cat for being elected 15 times. That's some great campaign.
Exactly.
I don't really know where to go after animal head of state.
We needed cheered up, let's be honest.
We did.
I think we should just move on to the next topic. I think there's nowhere to go after. I think there should be a Highland coup in charge of the country. Okay, there's a report from Climate Ready Clyde, which is a coalition of 15 councils, universities, the NHS and infrastructure bodies. It published as Glasgow's preparing to host the COP26 Global Climate Talks in November. Said that nearly 2 million people living in the Greater Glasgow area face severe disruption from climate heating unless billions are spent and invested in protecting homes, businesses and transport links. By 2050, there will be a 50% chance every year Glasgow will experience summers as hot as the record reached in June 2018. People remember that's when the temperatures hit like over 30 and it was buckling train lines and material was melting off the science centre and things like that. It's not just going to be hotter summers though, but we'll also average rainfalls in summers will fall, leading to droughts, and we'll experience flash floods in the winter because rainfall will increase with far more intense storms. So we're not ready for climate change.
No, shock.
Yeah, I mean, those stats are horrifying and really quite concerning. I think particularly in the last week when we've seen these really quite striking pictures of real impact to do with the climate and really freak weather, particularly across the UK and in other countries too. I mean, it's not surprising because we've been told about this for a long, long time. I felt a bit of a tipping point in political narrative before, obviously, the pandemic came along. There was a start of the discussion. I don't think it was radical enough. I don't think there was concrete, action put in place. I mean, it's clear there's a climate emergency, and then just build a coal mine in the northwest of England. I'm really quite concerned about this because it just kind of seems like we're just going from like one crisis into an intensified other crisis into an intensified other crisis. I mean, where to even start with what needs to be done to do this? Because it's going to cost a lot of money to mitigate some of these things that are inevitably going to happen. But there also needs to be real joined up radical change to Scotland's relationship with fossil fuels, the UK's relationship with fossil fuels, the West, that comment that I hate, their relationship with fossil fuels and consumption too. Yeah, I mean, it's just I always hate this phrase as well when it's used when people are talking about it, but it's so multi-pronged. There's so many different things that need to be addressed when it comes off the back of this specific report of, well, we need to address the fact that this is potentially going to happen, so we need to mitigate this now, and we need to put accountability in place for organizations that just continue to pump out carbon and cause the damage that is linked to the severe climate shifts that we're seeing. And we need to look at how we address and stop the spiraling out of control that has been happening, essentially over the last 50 to 60 years.
Yeah. Well, you're talking about stuff happening in the future. I'm going to refer to the Australian wildfires, which I'm pretty certain was a result of climate change. I'm going to talk about the extreme heat wave that's cutting across Canada and Pacific Northwest, 50 degrees Celsius at 50 latitude. What? That is insane. We're going to talk about all the floods that's going on right now as we speak. And also, you were talking about spiraling out of control. The ocean's on fire. Have you seen that? The whirlpool of flames from a gas leak. And
I showed that to my daughter, and she point blank refused to believe it was real. She's convinced it's CG. And I don't blame her. It looks like it.
It does.
It's like something out of a Zack Snyder film.
And that oil rig just sitting at the side, and this a whirlpool of fire, and we've set the ocean on fire. That's what we've done. I think the Earth is trying to get rid of us like a parasite, to be honest. We're being bombarded by so much stuff, by climate change, by the global pandemic. We're back to being depressed. The changes that are happening.
The roller coaster of emotions.
I know, the roller coaster of the Ungagged podcast. I like what Glasgow's done in some of their places. You've seen all the orcas for segregated cycle lanes.
I only saw them after you pointed them out to me. I sent you that wee video when I saw them.
I want to know how effective they are. Like, the cyclists feel safe in them, because I feel like I could do a wee slalom through them. Not that you should do that, but I don't know how, like, is that Glasgow's attempt at putting in this, cycle infrastructure in time for COP? Or what's that about?
It's better than a line of paint. At least you'll notice if you drift over them, I suppose. Which, a line of paint, somebody could be driving right along the cycle lane and no particularly even notice.
You don't even have a bike, David. What are you talking about?
I know. What are you even talking about?
I do have a car, so.
Oh well. I seen a thing as well, Glasgow up at St Enoch Centre. I've not seen them. I've not been there for ages. They had the city trees. Have you seen them? And it's like moss that absorbs. We need more of that happening. We need more bus stops with green flower, wildflower for all the bumblebee. We need to be doing more actual physical stuff that doesn't need to cost a lot of money to try and tackle some of the immediate climate change, like the flood defences, like you're saying. Have you seen that map that if the sea levels rise by a certain percent, and it shows you an animation of the Clyde Valley, I hate calling it a Clyde Valley, Strathclyde, getting all flooded? Have you seen that? What, it's like throwing a penny in an ocean that's on fire. What is the point? What do we really need to do? We need to, and I used to be against this, by the way, total decarbonisation, because I thought that's no fair to, people who are in fuel poverty, who maybe aren't connected to a network or a grid. They might have an oil burner, or, oil central heating, or, they work off a gas bottle or things like that. But I really think we need to be so bold. We need to make a change.
I mean, there's so many ideas, and like Lorna Slater of the Greens is really good at communicating this. I think much better than me, because of her work experience and her knowledge. Is that we already have the tools and the technology to do this.
Yes.
Okay. We just need to have the political will and the prioritization of these types of policies to make it happen. My parents live in high rises. Okay. Because they're mostly owned, it's mostly social housing. It's in these high flats. They're really, really well maintained. They have heat pumps. Okay, so they're all centralized heating. Okay, they've all got central heating, obviously, but they are centralized heating. They pay a really, really low price per month. Doesn't matter how much they use the heating or not. It's much, much cheaper than it would be otherwise. So you've got 9 high-rise flats all functioning off this one heat pump that goes right way down into the ground and takes heat from the ground. These are the types of things you need to do. But because we've sold off all our housing stock to private ownership, there's no joined up thinking anymore. So, you need to do real bold change, as in we need to, insulate the houses. We need to have communal heating and power structures in place. So we're not, if you've got in a high-rise flat where everybody's privately owned, they're all paying to different providers and there's no joined up thinking. These types of things need to change in order for us to make the radical quick change. So, and it actually stops fuel poverty as well.
Yeah. I seen a great thing, my MSP, shout out to Marie McNair. She was away visiting a heat pump system, community heat pump system in Clydebank. And just because we're talking about the Clyde, it takes heat from the river. And it's amazing technology. We live surrounded by water and we've got miles and miles of river. Let's get this in every place we can get it. Let's do more things like that, and more like what you're saying. Every wee street, every community heat pump, or drill into the earth, get geothermal heat, whatever, is more suitable for the situation.
Yeah. The whole sort of discourse around like climate change, it's like everybody accepts that climate change is real, apart from like sort of fringe lunatics that nobody takes seriously. Some of which have some influence, though, so I'm not totally dismissing them. But as much as everybody agrees it's real, people don't really believe it, if that makes any sense. Like, I find that myself. It's like, I know climate change is happening, but it's almost too frightening to really consider it. And when there's examples, like we're seeing more and more in the news of these crazy events that are, used to be once in a generation or once in a century, and they're happening every year, it just starts to feel too real, and it's terrifying. I think we've seen from the current pandemic response that our political institutions are just not up to dealing with any kind of crisis, never mind one on this scale. Capitalism is great at, getting people, what they want, getting them a particular type of trainers that they've decided they need, or sweeties that you can gorge yourself until you're massively obese. But it fails miserably when it comes to things like this. If you look at China and how China, and I'm not a big defender of China, but look how they're able to respond to something like the pandemic, and how they'll be able to respond to climate change when it hits the fan. They're able to roll out and build a hospital in 10 days to deal with stuff. What are we doing? We're still trying to get an app to work 18 months in.
Yeah, I think with the whole hospital in 10 days, we need to be mindful of the health and safety and the lack of union representation that was involved in that. Yeah, all these types of things. But I totally hear what you're saying.
I don't think there's much workers' rights in Dubai, but I don't think they'd be able to build the hospital that quick either.
Oh, I don't know. I don't know.
But no, they wouldn't be able to build a hospital. They might be able to build a luxury hotel in 10 days.
Yes, of course.
Yes. And as you say, capitalism's allowed us to have a McDonald's within a mile of us. That was their mission operative, to have a McDonald's within a mile of every person in the UK, which to me sounds absurd, but they can achieve that almost. At least it feels like that.
Surely we must be at peak capitalism, though. Surely.
I don't think so. I think there's more to come.
I know. I'm just trying to be positive. But then, of course, when it comes to climate change and stuff too, that all the institutions across the political spectrum really need to start buying into this, because the Lib Dem answer is like, oh, we'll charge you 10p for a plastic bag and we'll ban straws, like these sort of faffing around the outside. Or, we need to have loads and loads of wind farms, but we're just, like they did when they were in power with the Tories, is, they're all run by private companies, and, they're building all these different things abroad, which is using a lot of carbon to transport them, blah, blah, blah. We need to have a proper joined up thinking way of doing this in a way that it benefits the public purse, which is a phrase that I normally hate, but it's the only thing I can think of right now. But also,
there's a lot of phrases you hate, Brian.
Honestly, I just hate.
Got against language
so much. Honestly, that's for another pod. That cringe pod that we're talking about before we hit record. I'll do a little bit on that. All the different languagey things that I hate. Public purse. So, a proper climate plan that is beneficial to people who contribute to the tax system, and that does tackle the climate crisis, rather than just piecemeal saying, oh, but look at all the really pretty wind turbines we've got, and you're like, where was that built? And who built that? Some company that is pouring out carbon constantly anyway, and it was then transported across the world to be popped up in a field so we can see it. Aye, so the Lib Dems really are the answer. But I think we already knew that.
Yeah, I mean, it's like so much of the discourse around climate change is just no anywhere near the heart of the matter. Like, I think I did know this a while ago, but I forgot it, and I read it recently about how the phrase carbon footprint, who invented that phrase? It was BP.
Oh.
And their whole aim is to get people to focus on, like, what can you do to reduce thing? Well, they're an oil company. But they want to put the focus in like individuals and what maybe you could just walk to the shops and reduce your carbon footprint. Don't buy a dog. See, they're your whole head of state things that way. Buying a dog increases your carbon footprint. Well, they're an oil company that are setting fire to the oceans.
Yeah,
I know. It's
And you could offset your carbon footprint, couldn't you? How the fuck does that work? Where has it gone?
if you're Andrews and you just get a child to plant trees every time you buy Luro, do you know what I mean? Like this is
plant a tree in your garden.
And I'm laughing, but this is another thing where I'm just like, I'm laughing because it's just
frivolous. It's throwing a penny in the ocean that's swirling on fire. As I said, that's what it is.
And again, just going back to the discussions between the Scottish Government and the Greens, I'm hoping these are the types of things that we'll see a positive outcome for.
Well, I don't know if I'm allowed to tell you, but I've submitted 2 resolutions for our branch, and it's focusing around rewilding and banning toxic chemical use by the councils. There you go. So hopefully we get some traction on that. The Greens, I love the Greens, and I love, a lot of your aims that you have. I want SNP and the Greens to work together. I even want Labour to get in on this and all, because a lot of the issues are going to affect real people in their communities, whether that's really high air pollution, like we've seen here locally at Bearsden Cross. Sometimes we have some of the highest air pollution in Europe, except we're not in Europe anymore, so can't use that one, where we're in a flight path of the airplanes. There's so many things that we need to, as you said, capitalism can respond to the pandemic when they needed to, when it affected them. But really, we need capitalism to deal with the environmental impacts each of the multinational corporations have.
And we need to shift away from that individualism and response, like the carbon footprint you're saying, because I think, Greens also get bombarded as well, where it's like, oh, you're going to stop us from going on holiday. And I'm like, listen, you and your pals going to Malaga once a year or twice a year really isn't the major contribution to the earth being on, the sea being on fire. I think that where the focus needs to be shifted. Okay, there's things that individuals can do. There's choices that can be made around our diets, around rewilding, around all of these different things. But then you need to have the privilege and the financial position to do that. So if we want it to be partly responsible to the individual, we need to give them the tools to make the decision. And that's never happened, as we know from our first discussion, if we talk about the welfare state, and to how terrible the employment situation is in the UK. Or we turn the mirror back round to where it should be and look at these massive corporations that have just been pumping out carbon and essentially, devastating landscapes. And, that sea being on fire is a really striking image. And I don't think I'll ever unsee that, because I was like, that can't be real. And it is. But it's not just the fact that the sea is on fire, right, which is in itself is shocking. How many animals, plants, everything, same with these wildfires in Australia, the long terms of that, the long-term implications on that area is not just there was a fire, people died, we saved the koala bear, we saved the koalas. It's that whole land area is being destroyed, and it will take ages for nature to take its course, and it's nature that takes course, not human intervention, for that to actually fix itself. So we need to stop causing these things to happen so that we don't basically start destroying parts of the ecosystem, which is going to contribute to the flooding, to the droughts, to the extreme weather that we've already been seeing so clearly. And even that, I think it seems to be the last 6 weeks particularly, it's just been wild. And if this is not a wake-up call, well, everyone's distracted with the theatrics coming out of the UK government. We need to get this sorted now.
Well, it's summer, so that's where we're seeing a lot of the effects. In winter we had Texas basically freezing over, and their whole electricity grid collapsed because they never thought they'd have to deal with like sub-zero temperatures in Texas. What's interesting about this report is a lot of the usual discourse is usually about how can we work to prevent climate change and stop it happening. This is more talking about how do we survive it.
Yes,
it's almost like we're reaching that stage where it is more about how do we can't prevent it anymore. We need to find a way to get through it. And weirdly, that might be an easier sell to to governments and people, because they might see the threat coming and see the argument in spending money and sort of protecting ourselves, whereas, spending money to sort of prevent a theoretical faraway oncoming disaster maybe doesn't seem quite as urgent, even though it used to be 2050 sounded like a date out of a sci-fi movie. And now when you think, well, actually it's less than 3 decades away,
and the hard sell about things coming across the hill, COVID, if we had invested and prevented, then we probably wouldn't have had 18 months of constant cycle of restrictions and stopping our freedoms as it's been couched by the UK government.
I just don't think it's a future thing. It's a current issue. We are living in a series of increasingly more extreme, more violent, and more polarizing weather, from droughts to extreme snowstorms and hurricanes and all the rest of it. We've not even got the westerly winds yet, which is an annual thing in Scotland, bringing us the rains. Wait till that happens. We need to act decisively, immediately, and it has to have been done, as you say, 10 years ago. We can't mitigate anything, and we are just going to have to try and survive it. But I think we can really make changes that will improve the problems that we're seeing. We can cut down on our carbon emissions, get more electric cars, get, like in Shetland, they've got those power stations, that charging stations for your electric vehicles powered by the ocean. Get more of them happening. I think I'd just get an electric vehicle to go and sit by the sea, watching the waves, and that's powering my motor.
This is the two biggest contributors to climate change is transportation, all transportation, so people moving from one place to another, and energy production. And there you've said, so just moving to electric cars that's powered by certain companies that don't use renewable energy is just punting the problem from one place to another. But if we've actually got electric cars, which is, I know there's a lot of climate activists and things like that, because there's a lot more to do with private space and taking up too much space and infrastructure. But if we're talking merely about the impact on the climate right now, is that you've got renewable sources and powering your electric cars. That's a huge step forward, and then we can then start addressing the public transport situation, the infrastructure, all these things to move away from relying entirely on cars that has just become so normalized since the 1980s.
Something I stumbled upon online recently, a lot of the people that are most responsible, that have the most power, are billionaires.
Yeah.
And instead of sort of getting involved and trying to influence government, which they undoubtedly do have influence, to try to make some of these changes, they're all buying up like bunkers, like luxury underground bunkers and things like that. There's even a phrase that billionaires use now, like in their very expensive dinner parties, where they say, "Oh, I'm buying a house in New Zealand," which basically means I'm buying a massive underground network of cavernous tunnels in order to hide when everything goes pear-shaped. I would advise people to take a look, because these things are something to behold, like underground swimming pools with, I don't know how they've done it, specially created so it seems as if they've got natural light, even though they're like underneath 200 feet of concrete.
Wild.
Next up is the Batley and Spen by-election result. Sir Keir Starmer has declared Labour is back after the Labour Party held on to their Batley and Spen seat. The Labour leader headed to the constituency to celebrate with Kim Leadbeater after her narrow 323 vote win. Miss Leadbeater will now represent the seat previously held by her sister Jo Cox, who was murdered by a far-right extremist in 2016. So 323 votes to win it, a seat that they've held since the 80s, that they've had 5,000-6,000 seat majorities, but it's all good for Keir Starmer's Labour Party, apparently. Deborah?
I mean, it's no the resounding victory that he's sort of hailing, is it? I'm glad that Kim Leadbeater beat George Galloway, but did he request a recount or something? Because
he was.
He's a fanny.
I think he's wanting to go to he's wanting to go to court and stuff like that. God knows why. I mean, he lost by 5,000 votes, but he's claiming that there was some signs that were taken down by the council because they breached the rules. But he's just trying to lose with some classic George Galloway dignity, I suppose.
He's an idiot, isn't he? Aye, well done, Labour. You didn't lose.
Yeah, and that's probably the best way of encapsulating that success. I think that I'm really, really chuffed that the Tories didn't take a seat. I don't think we would ever have heard the end of it. But I think it's really important to see this in context, because I think the candidate, Kim herself, had been out there really quite publicly campaigning. Obviously, that it was Jo Cox's seat, and Kim is Jo's sister. And I know that basically the Tories kind of stood back and just let George Galloway and Labour rip chunks at each other. I mean, there was actually not much said by the Tory candidate. I think that they were just wanting those two to rip themselves to shreds, and they would go through the middle. And yeah, George Galloway is now requesting recounts and basically just being a complete arse and just keeping his own name in the headlines, which is all that George Galloway tries to do. But I think it's also important to see the context that this by-election took place after Matt Hancock's story broke. So perhaps that could have had some kind of impact on the Tories. I don't know. So that's a huge, massive story.
When you're talking at such a narrow sort of 300 votes, like anything could have swung that.
Yeah, and I think that could have had an impact on the Tory vote, perhaps, because we know that people don't like hypocrites, particularly when it comes to the COVID restrictions. And I think that played out with the opinion polls if Matt Hancock should resign, and also when Dominic Cummings done his Barnard Castle, that was very much reflected in that. So I think that actually the Tories, Matt Hancock's behaviour, potentially swung that by-election a little bit, because that was the weekend before the by-election and it was still running in all the newspapers the days up to that. So I think that would have had an impact. So this is always, by-elections are so weird, aren't they? Because you've got local issues, you've got candidates, you've got morons like George Galloway, you've got and there's no other seats campaigning, so it's all the media attention, particularly because Labour lost Hartlepool. It was like a real sort of micro reflection of local politics with national politics and everything that's going on just now. And I think Labour just got really lucky here, and basically that like Deborah said, well done Labour, you didn't lose. And if that's the attitude that we've got, and the polls are still putting the Tories way ahead, if there was a general election tomorrow, there's no doubt that the Tories would probably end up gaining more seats, probably at Labour's expense. And it's depressing.
Yeah, also what could have cost, there was, as sometimes happens at sort of high-profile by-elections, there was lots and lots of candidates from, micro parties, but just looking at most of them seem to be parties on the far right. You've got like the Heritage Party that picked up 30 votes, Jada Franson 50 votes, increased her votes very slightly from just doing against
33 or whatever it was she got.
Yeah, so she gets 7 more votes this time. The For Britain Party, which in the Freedom Alliance, they both sound like far right. Apologies if they're not, but sound like it to me. Then you had UKIP, English Democrats, I think are a kind of far right party. So there was a lot of sort of parties that none of them get huge votes, but with narrow margins, they all managed to leach away wee votes, numbers of votes each that probably would have went to the Tories, you'd imagine. So yeah, Keir Starmer, I don't see him lasting much longer, to be perfectly honest.
I really hope not. And this is no shade really for him, particularly as an individual. It's not. I just think it's nothing personal. I just think you're useless. And I think that all the media hype and all the, forensic this, forensic that, and only just this weekend that we've had the first major policy come out of the UK Labour about this Buy British thing. Yeah, I really don't think he'll last much longer, but then who's next? And that's even more stressful.
All tea, no shade.
Literally, yeah. If you're going to read, you're going to read, you know what I mean? I don't think it's not personal, but you're just useless.
One last thing that I was going to say before we move on is I only noticed, just before the actual election, that George Galloway's standing for the Workers' Party. I mean, the cheek of the guy, it was only in May when he was running in a extreme sort of British Unionist ticket, hanging about with rural landlords and declaring he was going to vote for the Tories, and now he's trying to claim he's the leader, the representative of the workers. It's just, the guy will say anything.
I was endorsed by the Scottish Game Association, wasn't she? Lording about with gillies on, shooting the pheasants.
And then 2 months later, I believe he was, I don't know what one, but I believe he was endorsed by one of the myriad communist parties that are floating about these days.
He's a chancer.
He's a chancer, he's a grifter, and he is basically just self-promotion. And if George Galloway is the genuine answer, I don't know what the question is. Because perhaps the George Galloway thing was more of a protest vote to kick it to Labour, but George Galloway is not the answer. Supporting Nigel Farage at the EU elections in 2019, and then the Alliance for Unity, which was just cringe. That I will never unsee that. The broadcast, the political broadcast, but it's just him in this big dining room with a big fireplace behind him. Anyway. So yeah, George Galloway is never the answer. And if we can take anything away from this by-election, please, everybody, particularly in England, if anyone's listening to this in England, George Galloway is never the answer. Pass it on.
Yeah, so next up, it was Mary Black made a speech in the House of Commons that resonated with a lot of people. She made a strong defence of trans rights and, called out that sort of shadowy alliance that has been manipulating a lot of online transphobia that comes from sort of extreme homophobic, far-right evangelical groups in the United States. And I think we're going to listen to that now.
We now go to Mary Black.
Thank you, Madam Deputy. Where once the UK played a major role in essentially exporting homophobia around the world, over the last decade, I'm glad to say that we've actually had a relatively positive story to tell. I mean, the previous speakers have eloquently spoken of the progress that we have made, but this Pride Month, I think it's important for us to take a snapshot of what it is currently like to be LGBTQ in the UK. As we've already heard, there's evidence that we are more likely to self-harm, more likely to feel suicidal, more likely to have negative experiences in accessing healthcare, more likely to be the victim of a crime, and less likely to feel safe enough to report it to the police. So we know that there is no shortage of areas where we still have work to do. But if you are a trans person, you are even more likely to experience everything I've just listed and worse. And that's because over the last 5 years, there has been an organised and concerted international campaign against the trans community. And the UK is no exception. Where 40 years ago, the media, the religious right and the institutional powers would spread fear and distrust about homosexuals, today we're witnessing the same tactics being recycled and deployed against the trans community. And we know this because the ICR published a study just this year looking at the evolution of extremism in the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And it found that, and I quote, transphobia has long been one of the most major and ubiquitous narratives around which the far right mobilises, and that transphobia should be recognised as a security concern. We also know it because the Southern Poverty Law Centre in the US noted as far back as 2017 that an annual right-wing fundamentalist event called the Values Voter Summit, where transphobia was openly discussed as a tactic to be deployed because rallying against homosexuals wasn't as effective as it once was. In 2017, one of the far-right panellists said, and I quote, "Trans and gender identity are a tough sell, so focus on gender identity to divide and conquer. Trans activists need the gay rights movement to help legitimise them. If we separate the T from the alphabet soup, we'll have more success." Now, isn't it interesting that it was around this same time that we seen a swathe of online Twitter accounts seek to establish themselves in the UK and purport to speak for LGB people against trans rights, especially when studies consecutively show that LGB people overwhelmingly support the trans community. Now, this panellist went on to identify a range of potential allies outside of the fundamentalist right who could potentially and be most effectively drawn in. Now, this list is women, sexual assault survivors, ethnic minorities who value modesty, economically challenged children, and children with anxiety disorders. So as with all far-right recruitment tactics, A minority has been targeted, and hatred and distrust are stoked against them by preying upon people's fears. In this instance, by projecting a manipulative and false narrative that there is a conflict between trans rights and women's rights, when the truth is we are battling the same problems and the same patriarchal beast. Trans people are just as likely, if not more likely, to experience poverty, crime, and sexual violence. So looking at the UK, we can see what was advised at this right-wing event playing out. We see self-prescribed organisations and blogs that have already been mentioned projecting things which are factually and scientifically incorrect. We see trauma and poverty being treated as a recruitment tool. We see attacks against women organisations and rape support crisis centres for daring to be trans inclusive. But worse yet, we see a media in this country that continually platforms and projects these hateful, disproportionate views uncritically. Now, I've always been clear that in order to progress, you have to give people the space to educate themselves and to ask the ignorant questions without fear of repercussion. Otherwise, nobody moves forward. But this has to be done respectfully and on the terms of those who are affected most. And that is not what's happening with the trans community. And that alone speaks volumes. I mean, more personally, my office and I have been left in a position for years now where our workload has been increased not just by world events, but not just my own distressed LGBT constituents getting in touch with me, but people from all across the UK who have contacted me because they're too frightened to contact their own MPs. These are constituents of Tory MPs, Labour MPs, and I'm ashamed to say SNP MPs. And I have ran out of excuses to give them because there are numerous parliamentary inquiries and reports which make clear the expert legal and medical advice and explain clearly what the lived experience and reality is for trans people. And it's there for anybody who wants to educate themselves on the matter. So be of no doubt, we are currently living within a moral panic right now, and it's being fanned by organised disinformation and online radicalisation. And if we, as legislators, capitulate to it, then all we do is send an international message that disinformation works. Now, my final remarks are to trans and queer people directly. This is an ugly and shameful time for all of us, but that shame is not yours to feel or yours to carry. In the same way that we teach young people about gay history now, and they're horrified when they hear of our past treatment, so too will future children when they find out how trans people were treated today. This will pass, and in the meantime, know that there are allies everywhere that are with you and are fighting for you, publicly and behind the scenes. And like our community is so often having to tell people, we are going absolutely nowhere.
So that was Mary Black. If you want to hear that again, you can find it. It's on Mary Black's Twitter account. Brian, what was your thoughts?
I think it was one of the most refreshing things that I've heard in the House of Commons for a long, long time. I think with it, like we're saying, as this podcast has shown, there's so many layers of different crises and prominent, policy interventions that need to happen across the UK. We've spoken extensively during Pride about how particularly trans community, non-binary people, gender non-conforming, genderqueer, all of these individuals have felt really quite targeted by mainstream media and the constant online barrage, which has really sprung up from around 2017, which is really interesting that what Mary Black was saying in that speech there, that these types of groups and these types of, the ideology and what's being perpetuated here is from around that time. And we've seen huge increase in its prominence. It's really sort of embedded in certain quarters in Scottish politics. And this speech was just such a breath of fresh air. And I got really teary at the end of it, I think particularly when she was addressing the trans community. And it was probably one of the most genuine and refreshing things that I've ever seen in a speech in the House of Commons for a long, long time. And, it's just great that we have great allies in some of the Scottish MPs, because there's been other people who have made great speeches from the SNP and from Labour too during this Pride debate, talking about issues of addiction and particularly the targeting of trans people. And that to me is like the real takeaway things that needs to really be addressed. And I'm glad that it was said in the House of Commons by Mary Black in the way that it was said. And I hope more so that this speech has been a bit of a reassurance for trans people. And I think based on the sort of reaction that I've seen on social media, a lot of trans people felt really included. They felt like they had a true ally, or almost like, somebody standing in solidarity with them. It wasn't just an ally like, yay, I'm going to wave my trans flag. It was somebody who was there inside the machine, actually sticking up for them all the time. And we need more of that. And what's really, really interesting is that we don't have a trans represented elected member, okay? And that, whether it be in Westminster or be in Holyrood, that in itself is really telling, particularly in this debate, because if you have a debate around this really, really important issue only by MPs or elected members, trans people aren't going to be involved in that discussion. And we've seen that in the mainstream media so much. And the fact that we now we need to have these queer individuals standing up for trans and non-conforming people in the House of Commons. Well, we shouldn't have to do that. We should actually have the representation there and allow these groups and allow these individuals to speak in these debates.
Deborah?
Yeah, I really appreciated the speech. It was, as you say, a real show of solidarity. I liked how she addressed non-binary folk and trans folk, alike. It was really an expression of what LGBTQIA plus community should be. It should be supporting each other. And I also liked that she called out SNP MP representatives who are a bit vocal about it. She's done it in a very sort of nice way, I thought.
Diplomatic, yeah.
Yes, very diplomatic, with a lot of sort of respect. We always keep talking about this because I think it's important that our wee podcast shows the solidarity to the trans community. They are our brothers and sisters. We love you. You are worthy. And I think that's sort of what Mary Black's speech did, that just sort of solidified that, be the best you who you are, and we love you for it. But I think it also challenged a lot of these ideologies or these common sense, we're standing up for women's rights, without actually considering what that actually means. Because what you're actually talking about is policing toilets. How's that standing up for women's rights? And again, the connections to sort of far-right Christian fundamentalists. We've known this. We've spoken about this in great detail. We know that these organisations, how they sort of sensationalise issues that aren't even an issue. Like, it's a lot of this stuff is fabricated nonsense, exaggerated, cherry-picked examples of situations. And it's like, come on, to fuck. Get a grip of yourselves. And although Mary Black was really respectful and, said everything so articulately, that's the sort of message I got from her. I got that vibe of she was saying, get a grip of yourselves.
Yeah, and you talk about that solidarity amongst the LGBT community, and that's what the far right are looking to break by turning to separate the T from LGBT. And they were quite explicit, though, that that's the first step. Like, once they've done that, they'll then come after the rest of the community, which just shows in all examples why solidarity is important. It's not just a nice thing to do, it's self-protection, because if you use solidarity with other people, they'll be there for you when you need their help.
Definitely. And I think that, everything that we're seeing from people who are gender critical or hold views against the GRA reform and its adjoining proposals, we see that basically what from a lot of these quarters is basically reinforcing patriarchal oppression of certain groups. It's why it's so important that feminism is intersectional and it takes into consideration people from different geographical locations, class, race, body ability. All of these types of things need to be considered within feminism, and just saying, oh, but this is eroding women's rights. Well, let's make sure that doesn't happen. Okay, and I'm saying that we need to make sure that doesn't happen, but we need to also be laser focused in what it is that we're actually talking about, because particularly in the context of Scotland, because the Scottish Parliament has no authority over the Equalities Act. Okay, so even if they wanted to, segregate the protections around women's safe spaces. They couldn't. So it's really important to remember that, particularly in Scotland. And also, it's really important to see the groups that are standing up for the trans community. And it's true what Mary Black was saying, that they were targeting, rape crisis centres, for goodness sake, that are trans inclusive. They've been trans inclusive for over a decade. Okay. And I know there's one of my friends who has worked for these types of organisations on and off for the last 6 or 7 years. Her experience, her colleagues' experiences, is like, how is it so exhausting to be a trans ally? Why is it so exhausting to actually provide the services that we're so motivated to do? And these people that work in the third sector, they're generally not paid well. There's a lot of precarity in this type of work, because you're relying on funding and from governments that's only given for certain periods of time. You're not helping if you're taking the stance and you're berating rape crisis centres, you're berating all these organisations that are trying to stand in solidarity with women, particularly vulnerable women and trans people, because they're facing similar or even worse abuse than what some cis women are experiencing. And I'm not here to say what is abuse, what isn't abuse, what's worse, what's not. But let's just make sure that we've got services that helps everybody. And let's stop trying to include really vulnerable people from services that they really, really need access to.
That's the crux of it, Brian. It's about inclusivity in, public services. And as you say, the Equalities Act isn't going to change.
Well, not by anyone who wants to be trans inclusive anyway. And that's important to remember, that the party that's responsible for overseeing the Equalities Act is the Tories, and that should be more concerning.
Yes.
For women's rights. And it shouldn't, we shouldn't be looking at the trans question when it comes to eroding women's rights. We should be looking at the far right, and we should be looking at these types of groups that want to essentially start chipping away at some of these protections that all groups have, not just women, other minorities right across the spectrum. So we had a brief chat right at the very start about, before we started recording, about how these COVID restrictions are always pigeonholed as about freedoms and stuff. Well, what about the freedoms of people that are refugees, or the freedoms of these people, these civil liberties and freedoms of people that are in minority groups that are completely overlooked by this Conservative government? I am more petrified about the Equalities Act being in the hands of the Conservative government in London than what I am about trying to make it easier for trans people to try and access the correct version of a birth certificate.
A lot of the discourse from anti-trans activists are, they're very familiar tropes when you look at the right wing and how they react to things. They take sort of either completely fabricated things or outlier incidents and then try to blow them up and create a kind of narrative that is completely untrue. Like, they do it in so many things. Like, every year there's always Fox News, they're always claiming there's a war in Christmas because they found a school in backwater nowhere that decided they weren't going to put a tree up. Or you get it here all the time that, you can't say Christmas anymore. Well, everybody I know says Christmas, and it's no, you need to call it Winterfest. And that was all based on, I think it was a council down the Midlands somewhere called their sort of Winterfest rather than Christmas, because not for any sort of PC reason. It's because they wanted to run it until the end of January to make more money. And yet this was like 25 years ago, you're still hearing about, no, you need to call it Winterfest now. You can't sing Ba Ba Black Sheep. And you're like, it's just nonsense. And they're doing it to trans people, and it has real world implications for them.
Yeah.
And it's no right, and it's no fair. Okay, so once again, if you'll have heard it there in the pods, but if you want to hear it again, go to Mary Black's Twitter account and listen to the speech, because it's really something worth hearing. And now to our favourite part of the podcast every week, we're going to talk about yet more Tory corruption.
More Tory corruption, more Tory corruption, more Tory corruption.
So this week in More Tory Corruption, the government has admitted that Matt Hancock and current Health Minister Lord Bethell have been using personal email accounts to conduct government business. Labour's called for an investigation into reports that there was also a fast-track system used for suppliers wanting government contracts based on recommendations from individual ministers, and that's for supplying things like the COVID track and trace scheme. and these also involve the use of Gmail addresses. Keeping records of emails and other documents is vital to the operation of things like the Freedom of Information Act, which allows public and journalists to request access to them. Using personal emails might leave emails and systems also open to sabotage, the things like ransomware, and than it would if you were using official ones that are encrypted. In some cases, official secrets and even national security could be compromised by this. So, Tories at it again. Brian?
Yeah, this is quite a common theme, obviously, that we've come up with a jingle for it, which is nice. The use of personal emails and not being able to get access to potential documents, or the risk that people can't get access to the documents. I don't know if I remember this correctly, but was that not what Nicola Sturgeon was really, really criticised for by the Scottish Conservatives? So there was a risk that there might have been some use of not the correct way of logging and saving communications between civil servants. I don't know how I remember this stuff, but anyway, I do. So it's just always interesting that everything that the Tories try to accuse the Scottish government of doing, or if there is an incident of it, whether it be a small incident, is jumped on, and then they're demanding that there's a vote no confidence. So it's just really interesting that the Tories are basically doing it in Westminster, and we hear crickets. So that's just my first point. Second point, fast lane for PALs for contracts. Well, we've got, if you tune into the other Tory corruptions that we've done on, well, we've got evidence of that. We've got evidence of people acting unlawfully. Michael Gove given contracts to Dominic Cummings' organisation that's contacts with Dominic Cummings. So basically, I cut and paste my answer from last week. There is Tory corruption. It's happening every week. Please use the correct emails for your own safety. Please stop giving contracts to your pals. And basically, can you just stop being so corrupt?
It's interesting you brought up that bit about civil servants, because if a civil servant done this, if they had used private emails, the wrong computer, the wrong phone, something that hadn't been through the security protocols that it needed to make sure that all their communications were safe and, not open to being hacked like you talk about, then they'd have been fired. It's interesting that the government ministers aren't holding themselves to the same standard that they hold civil servants. And as you said as well, bringing up the Nicola Sturgeon thing, it's just more Tory corruption in it, and ineptitude. Is it ineptitude? Is it corruption? Is it corruption? Is it ineptitude?
Or is it both?
I know.
It's a hearty cocktail of incompetence and corruption, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, I would get disciplined in my work if I was found that I was using my personal email rather than my work's email for sensitive matters.
Yeah. Like if I was contacting anyone from my workplace, like students, for example, on personal emails, it would just be, because it's just, well, first of all, it's not appropriate. Second of all, it's, why would you do that? 3, don't do it because it's against your work policy. And these types of things are gross misconduct in the workplace too. So you would actually face you would lose your job, and it's unlikely that even trade unions could save you in that one, because it's something so blatant. You would have to have, it's different if if you had 2 emails open and you sent something by accident, whatever. But if you're actually doing that on purpose, you've gone and set up an email address and communicating about work things with somebody else's personal email address. What? And it's basically trying to hide certain discussions, and also it could potentially remove them from the scope of any public inquiry.
Yeah, they can't be scrutinised, can they?
And then, then of course, was he not slagging off? Was Boris Johnson not slagging off Matt Hancock anyway on WhatsApp? So this is. I really don't think that they're following the correct communication channels that they should be doing anyway. And I would like to see Boris Johnson and other people face a disciplinary hearing. I'm happy to chair that.
It came out a wee while ago that Boris Johnson was still using the same phone he's had for 10 years, and that number apparently is freely available online. So if he's then using that to conduct official government business, any foreign governments looking to undermine the UK, I mean, they wouldn't need to work very hard because Boris does a good job of doing that himself, but, they'd be able to read his phone no problem. I'm sure the technology is out there.
Unless it's a Nokia 3310.
And nobody's getting in there. But also as well, could you imagine if Jeremy Corbyn had the same phone for 10 years?
He probably has, let's be honest.
He probably has. But you can imagine it being like,
do we even know he's got
Prime
a phone?
Minister. Well, there we are.
Okay, thanks for joining us again, guys. If you want to hear any other past podcasts we've done, you can find them on leftungag.org. We've got the Ungagged Film Club. We did the first pod of that last month. where we done a spoiler discussion of the movie Pride. This month we'll be doing another spoiler discussion on the sci-fi classic Starship Troopers.
Yes.
Also, if you want to also get good articles up there was a good article just went up the end of last week from Val Wardron. You can read that on leftungag.org too. And nothing else to say, but I hope you found this interesting and informative. And we'll hear from you next week. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much for listening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. See you later.